Siberia, where everything is being done to mobilize as many male as possible from indigenous population. But it's also about Crimea, the Ukrainian Crimea, which Russia has seized back in 2014. Among all the ethnic groups of Crimea, the male indigenous people of Crimean territories received the most of Russian draft notices. That's in proportion to the total number. This is a genocidal policy, frankly speaking. The fourth point, in front of the eyes of the whole world, Russia is conducting this so-called sham referenda on the occupied territory of Ukraine. People are forced to fill out some papers while being threatened by submachine guns, all for a nice TV cover. These alleged results of the sham referenda have been prepared well in advance, just as this compulsory issue of passports for the population of the occupied territories. Now, what's the reason for that? And the answer is in the next point, the fifth one, the annexation of the captured territories. This is the most brutal violation of the UN Charter. This is an attempt to steal the territory of another state. This is an attempt to erase the norms of international law. This is a very cynical attempt to force the male population in the occupied territory of Ukraine to mobilize into the Russian army in order to send them to fight against their own homeland. There is only one way to stop this all. First, it's a complete isolation of Russia in response to everything it does. A state cannot remain a permanent member to the UN Security Council with the right of veto if such a state is waging a genocidal policy right now, skipping the world one step away from a radiation disaster. And at the same time, it keep on threatening with nuclear strikes. Russia should be excluded from all international organizations. If such an exclusion is procedurally complicated, then its participation should be suspended. Second, there is a need for new and tough global sanctions against Russia. Any annexation in the modern world is a crime against all states that consider the inviolability of borders to be vital for themselves. Third, any Russian criminal actions do not change anything for us. We do not succumb to the blackmail of terrorists. It is in Ukraine and in this war that not only our independence has been defended, not only the right to life for our people, but also the international law as such. Ukraine must receive all the necessary defense and financial support so the aggressor would lose. Fourth, Ukraine should receive clear and legally binding guarantees of collective security. Since the independence of our country is of such a fundamental importance for many elements of global security, the world also needs a respective security architecture. And fifth, that's very important. I want everyone to understand this. Russia's recognition of these sham referendums as normal, the implementation of the so-called Crimean scenario and another attempt to annex Ukrainian territory will mean that there is nothing to talk about with this president of Russia. Annexation is the kind of move that puts him alone against the whole of humanity. Such a clear signal is now needed from every country in the world. I believe in your ability to act. I thank to the French presidency for the opportunity to participate in this meeting. Thank you all for your attention. Glory to Ukraine.
So I've been listening to a very determined President Volodymyr Zelensky of Ukraine making his case to the United Nations Security Council, saying that Russian threats to use nuclear weapons as a form of blackmail. He called for Russia to be isolated, for Moscow to be excluded from all international institutions, and the United States is reacting.
Last week, leaders from more than 100 countries from around the world gathered in New York to reaffirm their commitment to the UN Charter and many of the key principles it stands for: sovereignty, territorial integrity, and peace and security. Instead of attending high-level week, Putin announced a renewed conscription effort in Russia and instructed areas under Russia's military control to prepare for illegitimate snap referenda. He did send an emissary who threatened the use of nuclear weapons on a non-nuclear country to secure Russia's illegitimate military gains. The purpose of all of this is clear. Russia intends to try to annex these territories, and Russia does not respect this body. The pattern is clear too. Putin intentionally chose this moment to insult the charter that outlines principles we all collectively stand for: sovereignty, territorial integrity, peace, and security. And he did this during the most important week for the United Nations, high-level week. Putin intends to commit an act which the UN Charter was expressly designed to prevent: an attempt by one UN member state to take the territory of another by force. We know this will happen because it follows a well-worn Kremlin playbook. Russia runs sham referendum in areas controlled by Russia's military and its proxies, coercing people to vote at gunpoint. It then uses these referenda to try to lend a semblance of legitimacy to its attempted annexations of another sovereign state's territory. The rush for Russia to institute and complete these attempted annexations destroy even the facade of legitimacy. As Ukraine successfully regains control over more of its territory that was wrongfully seized by Russia, and more of Russia's atrocities are uncovered, Russia is rushing to draw a veil over its military losses and the war crimes it has committed. We know the outcomes of these sham referenda were predetermined in Moscow. They in no way represent a legitimate expression of the will of the Ukrainian people. The will of the Ukrainian people is clear every day as they fight valiantly for their country, as they protect their territorial integrity, as they defend their sovereignty. The Ukrainian people have already demonstrated they will never accept being subjugated to Russian rule. This council and the international community must do the same. So now let me be clear. The United States will never recognize any territory Russia attempts to seize or allegedly annex as anything other than part of Ukraine. We reject Russia's actions unequivocally, and we will continue to work with our allies, partners, and like-minded to impose cost on Russia and to provide historic amounts of support for Ukraine. Justice demands nothing less. Protecting the UN Charter demands nothing less. In our many meetings here in the Security Council, we've heard repeated calls for the UN Charter to be respected, but it is not enough to call for respect of the UN Charter. We must have the courage to defend it. That means standing up for Ukraine and the victims of Russian atrocities. It means having the courage to call out aggression and attempts at naked territorial expansion when we see it. It means showing we care about peace by demanding Russia honor the UN Charter. Not doing so only enables Russia to commit further abuses. Russia started this war, and I hope that every member of this council will do the right thing by standing up for international law and the UN Charter by calling on Russia to end it now. Ukraine's fight is not only a fight for survival, but a fight for democracy and the very principles that we all hold dear. That is why we will be tabling a resolution condemning these sham referenda, calling on member states not to recognize any altered status of Ukraine, and obligating Russia to withdraw its troops from Ukraine. Russia's sham referenda, if accepted, will open a Pandora's box that we cannot close. We ask you to join us in reaffirming our commitment to the UN Charter and meeting this challenge head on. If Russia chooses to shield itself from accountability here in the Council, we will then look to the UN General Assembly to send an unmistakable message to Moscow. The world must stand together and defend the Charter of the United Nations. Have courage and support Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. This is about defending the UN Charter. This is about defending our collective rights. And this is about peace and security for us all. Thank you, Mr. President.
Je remercie.
I thank the representative of the United States for her statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Albania.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, President. I would also like to thank USG DiCarlo for this very useful information she has provided.
I would like to start by a quote which reads, "Don't believe those who try to frighten you with Russia and who scream that other regions will follow after Crimea. We do not want a partition of Ukraine. We do not need this." This is what the president of Russia said in 2014. Everyone can judge by themselves. I doubt, though, this comes as a surprise to anyone, since for 9 months now, what we have heard from the Russian delegation here has little or nothing to do with what happens there on the ground. Two parallel realities. Now let's have a closer look of what will be known as the sham referendums being conducted these days by an extensive use of Kremlin's tricks. With the latest escalatory decisions and the partial mobilization, war has finally entered into the Russian households, and we have seen the reactions. Russians are resisting, they are protesting openly, and are massively leaving their country to escape drafting because they do not know why they should die in a war they do not want and they do not understand. In the city of Kherson, election officials went door to door with riot police. It is a well-known fact. When you vote at gunpoint, the process is more expedite. The so-called voting has been recorded on parked benches, in shops, even in the makeshift booths in the police stations, better known locally as the torture chambers, which were put to such good use. Elsewhere, doors have been broken down to facilitate the voting process. So much for the solemn moment of voting, so much for the OSCE rules and standards. Yet the result is in no doubt. The vote count, engineered in Moscow with an already scripted result, will reveal that residents would love to be ruled by the invading power, Russia. The haste with which these sham referendums are being held makes it unlikely that the spectacle will convince anyone, including Russians themselves, of their legitimacy. Nobody in the world will take seriously the result of people voting at gunpoint of a referendum in the ruins. Ladies and gentlemen, let's make it clear. The sham referendums in Luhansk, Donetsk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson have nothing to do with democracy, nothing to do with free will of Ukrainians, nothing to do with any international election standard. They are just a replay of the same old script applied in Georgia and Crimea. Now they translate a desperate effort to hide failure and a worthless attempt to legitimize conquest in the eyes of an incredulous and deeply troubled world. Russia is projecting panic instead of power, instilling fear instead of force. And why such a haste? Because Ukraine army is astonishingly pushing Russia out. Russians were told that everything is going to plan. It never did. Russia knows that it's losing big. Therefore, what I have qualified before here as the Russian referendum assembly line was quickly put into action. We don't want more of Ukraine, said President Putin in 2014, and suddenly the appetite of Kremlin has grown. 4 fresh territories are on the menu, comprising no less than 18% of the Ukraine territory. Mr. President, international law prohibits the occupier to change borders. Russia may claim that it has nothing to do with these plans, since they are held and organized by the residents of the regions. But reality now and in the recent past has shown clearly that this is not true. By mid-March, Russian occupation authorities in Kherson and Zaporizhia appointed administrative leaders. According to the Ukrainian law, heads of local state administrations are proposed by the Cabinet of Ministers of Ukraine and appointed by the president, not by Russian proxies. The sham referendums are against the constitution of Ukraine. A referendum can be called by the president or parliament or by a public initiative involving the valid signatures of at least 3 million registered voters, with at least 100,000 such signatures coming from every oblast. Furthermore, currently a martial law in force in Ukraine prohibits holding of any kind of elections or referendums. And finally, we have our own documents. According to UNGA Resolution 3314, annexation by the use of force of the territory of another state is in itself an act of aggression. The sham referendums run against the UN Charter, against UN resolutions, against international law, and are making a mockery of the principles that Russia has pledged to uphold as a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council, including when it threatens with the use of weapons of mass destruction. Mr. President, as stated last week by Prime Minister Edi Rama at the UNGA, we strongly condemn Russia's ongoing war and these premeditated mock elections in Ukraine. They have zero legality, zero legitimacy, zero credibility, and Albania will not recognize them. The Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, OSCE, the excellence in monitoring elections, condemned what it qualified as illegal referenda. Also, attempts to compare these referendums with other cases out of every historic and political context are simply worthless cynicism. We call on all UN members, everyone for whom the principles of territorial integrity, sovereignty, and inviolability of borders have a meaning, to oppose Russia's actions, condemn the referendums and their anticipated results, and never recognize any attempt to steal Ukraine land through violence and terror. Colleagues, while the war goes on, while Russia is hastily trying to change Ukraine's map, the Human Rights Council Commission of Inquiry on Ukraine has concluded, based on evidence, that war crimes have been committed by the Russian Federation in Ukraine. Last week, in this chamber, ICC Prosecutor General said that the bodies lying on the streets he saw in Bucha were real, not staged. Crimes committed in Ukraine are being meticulously documented. They will not be prescribed and will follow perpetrators until their last days. Also, we in the Security Council cannot stay idle. As we heard from the US delegation, together we have prepared a draft resolution to condemn the sham referendums, which has been shared with the Council members. Borders cannot change to satisfy Russia's appetite, and Ukraine is not and cannot be Russia. We must stay united and continue helping Ukraine defend itself and get its territory back. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Albania for his statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Ireland.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, President.
Carlo, for your briefing, and President Zelensky for your statement. The President of Ukraine used the phrase sham referenda. Ireland fully agrees. We condemn these sham referenda being conducted in occupied Ukrainian territory by Russia or its proxies. No one who believes in and is fully committed to the principles enshrined in the UN Charter of sovereignty and territorial integrity of states could do otherwise. Why is this? Because these referenda, these sham referenda, are both illegal and illegitimate. They are illegal because they violate the UN Charter and Russia's obligations under international law, including the law of occupation. They also ignore Ukraine's constitution, which provides a legal basis for any referenda that would affect the territorial boundaries of Ukraine. And they are illegitimate because they do not reflect the popular or freely expressed will of the Ukrainian people. As we've previously heard in this chamber, over 1 million people from those occupied territories have been moved to Russia. This is as a result of Russia's military invasion, including by forced deportation. In fact, more than 7 million people are internally displaced within Ukraine because of this war. Mr. President, these referenda will never deter us from supporting the people of Ukraine. Might does not make right, nor will they have any legal or political effect on the status of Zaporizhia nuclear power plant or other Ukrainian nuclear facilities. These referenda are a cynical ploy to not only further undermine Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity, but also to try and reset an unjustified war. This is a blatant land grab to redefine areas of Ukraine as part of Russia. A blatant land grab. Mr. President, Ukraine has had a hard-won independence. It has had a hard-won path to establishing itself as a sovereign democracy free from foreign interference. It is sticking bravely to this choice, no matter what has been thrown at it. In particular, Ireland condemns Russia's nuclear threats and all nuclear threats, whether explicit or implicit, regardless of circumstance. Ireland once again calls on Russia to end its aggression immediately, to comply with its obligations under international law, and withdraw all forces unconditionally from the sovereign territory of Ukraine. The people of Ukraine, as much as the people elsewhere in the world who are suffering the devastating impact of this war, deserve no less. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Ireland for his statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of India.
Thank you, Mr. President. I will very briefly intervene. I thank Under-Secretary General Rosemary DiCarlo for her remarks. Mr. President, as stated by my minister in this very council at the last meeting on this subject, the trajectory of the Ukraine conflict is a matter of profound concern for the international community. India has repeatedly called for an immediate cessation of hostilities and the need to resolve the ongoing conflict through dialogue and diplomacy. This was also stated unequivocally by Prime Minister Modi during his meeting with President Putin in the sidelines of the recent SCO summit in Tashkent. We firmly believe that the global order should be anchored on international law, the UN Charter, and respect for the sovereignty and the territorial integrity of states. India's approach to the Ukraine conflict will continue to be human-centric. On our part, we are providing both humanitarian assistance to Ukraine and economic support to some of our neighbors in the global south under economic distress, even as they stare at the escalating costs of food, of fuel, and of fertilizers, which has been a consequential fallout of the ongoing conflict. Mr. President, the need of the hour is to end the conflict in Ukraine and return to the negotiating table. This has already resulted in the loss of countless lives and miseries for people, particularly for women, children, and the elderly, with millions becoming homeless and forced to take shelter in neighboring countries. Let us all work together to ensure that this comes to an early end. Thank you.
I thank the representative of India for her statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Ghana.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would like to begin my statement by thanking USG Rosemary DiCarlo for her briefing. We join other speakers in expressing our deep concerns about the ongoing Russian aggression against Ukraine in violation of the fundamental principles of international law, especially relating to sovereignty, territorial integrity, political independence, and the recognition of states. The invasion against Ukraine undermines, in our view, the purposes and principles of our charter and stands in contrast to the norms which have guided recent interstate relations and given endurance to the international system. As confirmed by several heads of state and government during the just ended general debate of the General Assembly, the impact of the war has had palpable effects on the lives of millions of people across the world. It is their desire that this war and many such others be ended as soon as possible for peace to prevail. We therefore caution against heightening rhetoric and giving expression to contemplations that threaten the use of nuclear weapons, as that can only lead into the dark abyss of a nuclear catastrophe with no winners. We urge maximum restraint by all sides in what has so far been an effort at conventional warfare. Mr. President, Ghana is particularly concerned about the ongoing referendum in the regions of Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson, and Zaporizhia, We regret the attempts that are being made to disintegrate the legitimate authority of the government of Ukraine over its state territory. The process of the referendum, as we have heard, can least be described as free, fair, democratic, or reflective of the will of the people of Ukraine. We reiterate our principled position against the acquisition of territory through the threat or use of force. We cannot continue to live in parallel universes and accordingly urge the international community to use the full weight of its will to serve as a bulwark against such practices, which have a propensity to unravel the tenuous global stability that we presently have. We note with concern the unfortunate rise in humanitarian casualties as fighting continues in the eastern and southern parts of Ukraine. Unless an immediate ceasefire is reached, the escalation of military combat would result in further dire consequences for all. We therefore reiterate our call for an immediate cessation of hostilities. We also call on the parties to refrain from targeting civilians and destroying civilian infrastructure in accordance with their obligations under international humanitarian law and human rights law. We urge the Russian Federation, which has often attempted to situate its special operations within the ambit of international law, to respect the sovereignty of Ukraine and withdraw its troops from the internationally recognized borders of its neighbor. Mr. President, to safeguard international peace and security, we must urgently deepen diplomacy and widen international efforts to defuse the rising global tensions so as to facilitate a peaceful settlement of the conflict. The situation in Ukraine reinforces the imperative for a reformed and responsive council that is able to address all threats to international peace and security, including by all actors. Pending the much-needed reforms, we must continue to work together in finding pragmatic ways to address the challenges that confront our collective security. I thank you, Mr. President.
Je remercie.
I thank the representative of Ghana for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of the United Kingdom.
Thank you, President. Let me thank Under-Secretary General De Carlo for her briefing. And I welcome the participation of President Zelensky in this meeting. Mr. President, Russia's holding of sham referenda in Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson regions of Ukraine is an egregious violation of Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity, and of the principles of the UN Charter. As the UN have told us today, this process is both illegal and illegitimate. It is a shameless propaganda effort aimed at justifying Russia's illegal presence on sovereign Ukrainian territory. We have seen Russia's referendum playbook before in Crimea. We see it playing out again now. Disinformation, intimidation, and fabrication. As my Foreign Secretary told the Council last week, we know that President Putin is planning to rig the outcome. These are regions that voted overwhelmingly to join an independent Ukraine in 1991 and to back President Zelensky in 2019. When given a free vote, their choice has been clear: to be part of a free, independent, democratic Ukraine. Since invading, Russia's control in these regions has been through violence, torture, filtration, and forced deportation. We've all seen images of soldiers with automatic rifles accompanying the ballots as they move from door to door, forcing Ukrainians to take part. Any referenda held under these conditions at the barrel of a gun can never be remotely close to free or fair. And the very idea that a referendum on a fundamental question could be held at 3 days' notice in the middle of a war zone is frankly farcical. We must all unequivocally reject these illegitimate actions and Russian attempts to illegally annex Ukrainian territory and support the draft resolution the US and Albania have brought forward today. Colleagues, this is a critical moment. There is no middle ground. No member of the United Nations should turn a blind eye to Russia tearing up the principles of the UN Charter. If we allow Russia to believe it can change sovereign borders by force, then the entire system on which we base our shared safety and security is under threat. These Potemkin referenda, as well as Putin's decision to mobilize Russian men to fight in his illegal war, are admissions that his invasion is failing. Instead of sending thousands more of his own citizens to their death and inflicting further destruction on Ukraine, he should end this senseless war today. Thank you.
Du Royaume-Uni de sa déclaration.
Thank you for your statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Brazil.
Thank you, Mr. President. I thank Undersecretary Di Carlo for her briefing. Brazil shares the concerns about the referenda in regions of Ukraine. In the current conditions, this is yet another step that leads to an escalation of the conflict. Far from expressing the will of the people of Donetsk, Lugansk, Kherson, and Zaporizhia regions, the referenda tend to make the prospect of peace negotiations even more distant. The UN Charter and the International Covenants on Civil and Political Rights and on Economical, Social, and Cultural Rights recognize the inalienable right of all peoples to self-determination and to freely decide their political status. This is a fundamental principle of international law, which is the very basis of the legitimacy of states. Many times before, especially in the context of decolonization, the holding of referenda was the means chosen for peoples to express their free will. Resolutions of this Council established the use of this instrument as a legitimate practice to decide on issues of sovereignty and territorial integrity. Its validity, however, depends on certain conditions. It is unreasonable to assume that populations in areas in conflict are able to freely express their will. International practice recommends that referenda on questions of sovereignty be conducted in a transparent manner, without restrictions on freedom of expression, and with the possibility of monitoring by independent observers. This does not seem to be the case for the aforementioned regions of Ukraine. Brazil stands by the principles of respecting territorial integrity or political unity of sovereign and independent states. Mr. President, we reiterate our call for an immediate ceasefire and the opening of peace negotiations. The Istanbul agreements in July and last week's prisoner exchanges were positive signs that demonstrate the value of diplomacy in reducing the human suffering resulting from this conflict. These advances, while extremely relevant, are insufficient. It is essential that the parties refrain from adopting measures that result in an escalation of hostilities, including in rhetorical terms. The moment calls for restraint and pragmatism. We believe that this Council is primarily a forum for negotiation and for dialogue. So far, we have collectively failed to find creative solutions to the conflict. Negotiation and dialogue, advocated by most members in their interventions over the past 7 months, presupposes a willingness to listen. Perhaps we should ask ourselves how sensitive we are to the concerns of others, especially to the lives of those on the ground which should come before any political considerations. And I thank you.
Je remercie
I thank the representative of Brazil for his statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Mexico. Thank you, President. I would like to thank USG DiCarlo for her briefing, and I would like to thank President Zelensky for his comments to this meeting. We are monitoring reports of the convening of referenda in the Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson, and Zaporizhia regions. General Assembly Resolution 1514 clearly states that any attempt aimed at the partial or total disruption of the national unity and the territorial integrity of a country is incompatible with the purposes and principles of the United Nations Charter. We therefore urge all states to refrain from taking measures that aim to disrupt, totally or partially, national unity, or which subvert the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine, or indeed of any other country. We reiterate that, in line with Article 2, Para 4 of the UN Charter, any attempt to change borders through the threat of or the use of force or through any other means which is incompatible with the purposes and principles of the United Nations violates international law. We underscore people's right to self-determination, as is laid out in General Assembly Resolution 2625, which also states that the enjoyment and exercise of this right cannot be understood, and I quote, as authorizing or encouraging any action which would dismember or impair, totally or in part, the territorial integrity of sovereign and independent states. End of quotation. In sum, Mexico's position remains in line with General Assembly Resolution 68/262, and given the seriousness of the environment in which the so-called referenda have been organized, we reiterate our call for urgent dialogue between the parties and to strengthen diplomatic channels to promote confidence-building measures, and, as the Foreign Affairs Minister of Mexico said last week to this council, and to open new fora for mediation that can lead to a cessation of hostilities. Thank you.
remercie
I thank the representative of Mexico for his statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of China.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, China has noted the latest changes in the situation in Ukraine and has listened carefully to the views expressed by the parties in this regard. Our position and proposition how to view and handle the Ukraine issue is consistent and clear. That is, the sovereignty and territorial integrity of all countries should be respected. The purposes and principles of the UN Charter should be observed. The legitimate security concerns of all countries should be taken seriously. And all efforts conducive to the peaceful resolution of the crisis should be supported. China has always stood on the side of peace with a commitment to promote peace and dialogue, and will continue to play a constructive role. Mr. President, in the just concluded GA general debate, many leaders expressed their concerns about the prolongation and expansion of the crisis in Ukraine and its spillover effects. And called for dialogue and negotiation to cease hostilities and manage the negative impacts caused by the spillover of the crisis. The recent developments remind us once again that peace is a quest for all. Bloc confrontation, political isolation, sanctions, and pressurization will only lead to a dead end. The task at hand is to push the parties to open the door to a political settlement as soon as possible and to include the respective legitimate concerns in negotiations and to put all viable options on the table. The signing of the Black Sea Grain Initiative has shown that even in conflict situations, diplomacy can produce results and bring hope. We need to uphold an international order based on international law and adhere to the basic norms of international relations based on the purposes and principles of the UN Charter. And these should not be mere political slogans. The Security Council, as a core of the international collective security mechanism, should make full use of the mediation tools given by the Charter and stick to the right direction, i.e., that of ceasefire and peace talks. It should, in particular, take constructive and responsible actions to accumulate conditions and open up space for a political solution. China work with all peace-loving countries to continue to make unremitting efforts to de-escalate situation and resolve the crisis. Thank you, Mr. President.
Je remercie
I thank the representative of China for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Kenya.
Thank you, Mr. President, and welcome back. I thank USG Rosemary DiCarlo for her briefing on the dire situation in Ukraine. We again send our heartfelt condolences to all Ukrainians who are suffering the physical, psychological, and economic ravages of war. We are very concerned with the reports of referenda being held in Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson, and Zaporizhia, and their impact on Ukraine's status as a member of the United Nations and on international peace and security. The UN Secretary General has stated clearly, and I quote him, "Any annexation of a state's territory by another state resulting from the threat or use of force is a violation of the UN Charter and of international law." Close quote. This is the fundamental truth that should be heeded by the Russian Federation and all members of the United Nations. The referenda will undermine the prospects of a longer-term negotiated peace settlement. By attempting to create a fait accompli, they will encourage those who are increasingly put their faith in the strengthening of armed alliances in preparation for war. As if this were not sufficiently alarming, we have heard serious threats being made of the use of weapons of mass destruction. To pull back from the brink of disaster, Kenya calls for an immediate cessation of hostilities and a stop to all attempts to unilaterally alter internationally recognized borders. Mr. President, our frequent briefings, debates, and consultations on the situation in Ukraine are taking place as the economic and conflict situations in different parts of the world get worse. Unfortunately, the most powerful actors are focusing far more on this conflict in Europe than on any other crisis. There appears to be little appetite, and because of this war, even less unity to deliver the reforms and policies that we all know are needed. Mr. President, bold action is required to halt the extreme food insecurity and even starvation in the world. The World Food Programme has calculated that in Eastern Africa, just as an example, fertilizer prices have more than doubled in the last year, and especially so since the invasion of Ukraine. Fuel prices have also risen sharply. WFP calculates that the result will be a year-on-year decline of 16% in cereal production, representing 7.2 million metric tons. In an already food insecure region, the impact will be to increase the number of hungry people by almost 7 million. This situation is reflected in other regions. It is a matter of life and death for all actors to respond to the global food insecurity crisis. The Black Sea Grain Initiative and the agreement to ensure unimpeded exports of Russian food and fertilizer to world markets were a promising start. It is imperative that all institutions that are enforcing compliance with sanctions ensure that all unintended blockages are removed. There are sufficient reports of negative secondary effects on banking, insurance, transport, and other critical enabling mechanisms. We also urge major grain and fertilizer producers to avoid stockpiling and breaking delivery contracts. Ongoing plans to create emergency mechanisms in this regard may be at the serious detriment of global food security. We urge that any efforts to design and deploy emergency food and energy security mechanisms be accompanied by planning for transformed food systems in the most food insecure regions. A major part of this would be making the necessary investment in sharply increasing agricultural productivity, particularly in Africa. Doing so is key to preventing cycles of humanitarian crises and the declining donor-funded responses to the worst of them. It will also allow investing in climate change resilient food systems at a time when catastrophic effects are being experienced in multiple regions. Finally, greater production, increased storage, and sufficient transport infrastructure will lead to low food prices and therefore greater political stability. Mr. President, the multilateral system cannot continue as it is today. The major powers are so bent on protecting and projecting their interests and security concerns that they seem unable to act in the broader interests of our United Nations. Today, the inarguable truth is that the protections afforded by membership of this organization are insufficient. Rather than the Charter granting us equality, we are governed by the destructive logic encapsulated by the saying, and I quote, "The question of justice only enters where there is equal power to enforce it, and that the powerful exact what they can, and the weak suffer what they must." It is time we sought real changes in global institutions, including this Security Council. It is time for real inclusion and real fairness. We can start with procedural rules in the Council and eventually make changes to the Charter. The reforms should not be limited to allowing only other major powers a seat at the table. It is clear from the historical record that the voice and presence of developing countries with no major military interests to protect regionally or globally needs to be strengthened significantly. A multilateralism founded on the principle of the powerful exacting what they can while the weak suffer what they must is a poor protection against the scourge of war, as we are all witness today. Madam President, or Mr. President, sorry. Kenya reaffirms once more its recognition of Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Kenya for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of the United Arab Emirates.
Mr. President, I would like to begin by thanking Undersecretary General Rosemary DiCarlo for her updates. Having just concluded this year's high-level week of the General Assembly, a resounding message we heard from many world leaders remains at the forefront of our minds. The world wants peace in Ukraine. It seems, however, that we are moving further away from this common objective of peace and stability. The referendums that are now underway further complicate efforts for a peaceful resolution to this conflict. In order to be credible and sustainable, any processes that aim to bring us closer to peace must be inclusive, and any actions that undermine this prospects for constructive dialogue must be avoided by all parties. We re-emphasize the need to respect the principles of territorial integrity, sovereignty, and independence, which are core to the UN Charter and central to constructive relations between states. These principles protect all states equally, whether large or small, and collectively, we must not allow their erosion. In pursuit of peace, this Council has an essential role in preserving these principles, prioritizing the peaceful settlement of disputes, and maintaining international peace and security. We recall here the January 2022 joint statement of the permanent members of this Council, affirming that a nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought. Over the past few months, we have seen incremental movement between the parties that has led to tangible, positive outcomes on concrete issues. We commend the United Nations and others that have facilitated constructive engagement in this regard. Most recently, the fruits of these efforts have included prisoner exchanges conducted with the assistance of Turkey and Saudi Arabia, and agreements related to the export of grains and fertilizer, which have helped to alleviate pressure on global food supplies and prices. There is further potential to build on these agreements. Moreover, the direct engagement that brought them to fruition can help diffuse tensions and open a pathway for conflict resolution. To this end, the parties must be supported in moving toward dialogue and away from further escalation. We once again underline the necessity of all parties abiding by their obligations under international law and international humanitarian law. Mr. President, the war has carried on for over 7 months with no sign of abating. During this time, nearly 14.5 million people were forced to flee their homes, with more than 7 million of them now displaced across Europe. Humanitarian costs have been immense, with more than 17 million people in need of humanitarian assistance. It is long past time for this conflict to come to an end. For that to happen, we continue to emphasize the importance of an immediate cessation of hostilities throughout Ukraine. Additionally, it is essential to build on and amplify positive developments between the parties, so we can begin to pull back from this dangerous point of heightened global tensions. What we need now is to secure a peace that is sustainable and in accordance with the UN Charter and international law. Thank you, Mr. President.
Je remercie.
I thank the representative of the United Arab Emirates for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Norway.
Thank you, President. We thank USG DiCarlo for her briefing. In the last day, we have all seen images of armed Russian soldiers going door to door in occupied parts of Ukraine to collect votes for a so-called referendum on joining Russia. This is a phony pretext from the aggressor, Russia, to try to annex more parts of Ukraine. And let me be clear, Ukraine has not authorized these referenda, and Norway rejects these Russian fabrication in occupied regions of Ukraine. Whatever outcome Russia announces, they remain contrary to international law, have no legal effects, and would in no way change Ukraine's sovereignty within its international recognized borders. President, we are also clear that no territorial acquisition resulting from use of force shall be recognized as lawful, and that no Russian claims to annex territory can take away Ukraine's right to defend its own land. All states, including Russia, have an obligation under Article 2 of the Charter of the United Nations to refrain in their international relations from the threat or use of force against the territorial integrity and political independence of any state, and to settle their international disputes by peaceful means. Russia's announcement of the mobilization of reserve forces is another issue of grave concern. It is a dangerous escalation which will lead to increased suffering for people in all parts of Ukraine. President, unspeakable horrors were relieved in Bucha, in Izium, and other places occupied by Russian forces. The Independent International Commission of Inquiry on Ukraine concluded in the update given last Friday that war crimes have been committed in Ukraine by Russia. The use of explosive weapons in populated areas have been a source of immense harm and suffering, not distinguishing between civilians and combatants, adults or children. The Commission also found accounts of ill treatment and torture carried out during unlawful confinement, and that Russian soldiers have committed sexual and gender-based violence. The age of victims ranged from 4 to 82 years. The Commission has documented cases in which children have been raped, tortured, and unlawfully confined. Norway condemns these acts in the strongest terms and calls for accountability for the perpetrators. President, this war has had abhorrent impacts on the people of Ukraine and now is being felt across the globe. We must work urgently to bring it to an end. Norway expresses its full support for the Secretary General's good offices, and when the time comes, we will stand firmly with the UN's effort to build and sustain peace. The Ukrainian people are paying with their lives to defend universal values and their own independence. Ukraine can count on Norway's continued support. Russia must stop the war and fully, immediately, and unconditionally withdraw its forces and military equipment from all territory of Ukraine. And again, Norway will never recognize these so-called referenda, and we stand by Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. Thank you.
Je remercie.
I thank the representative of Norway for her statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Gabon. Thank you, President. I would like to welcome President Zelensky to this meeting, and I thank USG DiCarlo for her briefing. President, we are concerned by the many signs pointing towards the worsening of the war in Ukraine. During the general debate of the General Assembly last week, we heard most world leaders clearly calling for negotiations to find a lasting solution to the situation in Ukraine. We will continue to call for de-escalation. The parties must refrain from any action that might fan the flames, and they must prioritize measures to guarantee peaceful coexistence. The United Nations Charter, which is the foundation of our common life, must guide all the parties in respecting the sovereignty and territorial integrity of all members of the international community. President, we call on the parties to do their utmost to resume negotiations so as to put an end to the war without conditions. The humanitarian situation is only getting worse, and the shock waves from the war are continuing to spread, leading to more death and despair. My country urges the parties to cease any inflammatory rhetoric that might escalate the conflict and encourage the use of weapons of mass destruction. To conclude, we once again call on the parties to lay down their weapons and to take any opportunity to find peace. We support the various bilateral and multilateral initiatives that are geared towards finding a constructive dialogue and lasting peace between the parties. Thank you. The President, I thank the representative of Gabon for her statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation.
Mr. President, the Donetsk and DPR and LPR and also Kherson and Zaporozhye Oblast held referenda on joining the Russian Federation. Over the next few days, the results will be published. It is a long-awaited event for the inhabitants of Donbass who, for a long time, have sought to bring peace to their land that they haven't seen for 8 years. For those 8 years, the inhabitants of the territories have lived in constant fear for their lives. The shelling of DPR and LPR, all of these years occurred every week and killed dozens of people and killed children. The inhabitants of Kherson and Zaporizhia areas can finally rest assured that they will not have their right to speak Russian or to teach their children in Russian taken away from them. And also the day of victory is one that they can celebrate, and they don't have to celebrate the fascists. From 2014 onwards, Kiev has deliberately focused on the physical destruction of the inhabitants of LDR and DPR, the people who they don't like. And with the backing of the EU and the US, they didn't lift a finger to force the Kiev authorities to uphold the Minsk agreements that guaranteed the safety of the citizens in those republics and a dignified future within Ukraine. I'd like to remind you that the Minsk agreements provided for a ceasefire, direct dialogue between Kiev and Donbass, granting it specific status through the adoption of a new constitution as well. All of these agreements were cynically flouted by the Kiev authorities, violating inter alia UN Security Council Resolution 2202. Western delegations not only were not astonished by this, but they secretly and also clearly supported it. If it hadn't been for this criminal connivance and hypocrisy, if the West had forced its subordinates in Kiev to uphold the basic human rights, the respect for their compatriots, and primarily their right to life, our special operation would not have been needed at all. The authorities of Ukraine clearly stated that Russians and Russian-speaking citizens of these regions were not people. Vladimir Zelensky, in an interview in August last year, said that everybody who considered themselves to be Russian or likes the Russian language for their sake and for the sake of their children should get out of Ukraine and go to Russia. Now the inhabitants of Donbass, Kherson, and Zaporizhia Oblast are carrying out his cynical recommendation. They're returning to the homeland, and they're taking their land with them that their forefathers lived on for centuries. Clearly, what also played a role, undoubtedly, was the fact that the population of Crimea was saved from the tragic situation unfurling in Donbass in 2014, when they chose to return to become a part of Russia. We've heard similar accusations of aggression and annexation. For 8 years, the people in Crimea has seen their lives change for the better. They live without fear for their lives. And we, over these past 8 years, have invested in the development of the region, and we've developed, like we're going to develop Donbass and other territories that Kiev is deliberately trying to bring to ruins. Aware that our former Western partners are not listening to us, or will rather pretend not to listen to us. However, I'd like to say that the referendum were conducted exclusively, transparently, with upholding of all electoral norms. This is an undisputed fact. However, the Kiev regime and its backers want to say anything to the contrary. More than 100 independent international observers observed it from 40 countries. They actively put their opinions on the media, and they were particularly surprised by the enthusiasm of the people of the DPR and LPR and Kherson and Zaporizhia Oblast, and how enthusiastic they were about the referendum and how long they had awaited them. Unfortunately, you won't hear this on the air of Western media, and you won't see any interviews with inhabitants of these regions either. Western countries initially stated that they would not recognize the results of these referenda, and they threw their entire weight behind the propaganda machine to besmirch them. We're not surprised by the propaganda-based planted information that apparently the people were forced to vote, that they were questioned to force them to choose to accede to Russia, or as the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Germany, Annalena Baerbock, said, they were shot, they were raped, and then they had to place a cross on a ballot box, a ballot vote, while soldiers with Kalashnikovs were standing beside them. So it seems that they have to vote after they've been shot and raped. Is that the case? And those cold soldiers who were holding the Kalashnikovs apparently were involved in provocative acts in the country. Apart from the propaganda machine, the Ukrainian armed forces lent all its might behind, well, in fact, the Western military might, behind stepping up artillery, shelling of towns where there were referendum to sow panic among citizens and to make vain attempts to undermine the vote. The temper tantrums of these Western delegations, including today in the Security Council, shows that a direct vote of citizens has long seeked to be the criterion from a democratic election. The recognition of such is only if it's approved by the West. The Western version of democracy was born in the dictate of the liberal minority over the conservative majority. This form of the denial of rights of non-liberals and non-Russophobes, other thinkers, is used not only in Ukraine, incidentally, but also by their allies in the Western Bloc. Just the day before yesterday, the head of the EU Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, openly threatened Italy with consequences if the outcome of the elections in Italy do not please Brussels. On the blacklist is Hungary, and a candidate for accession that is enjoying the most enthusiasm at the moment, despite the fact that it has historical links with Russia, is Serbia. They're trying to force it to adopt a position and to support the economically destructive sanctions against it. A very recent example, the US ambassador in Belgrade yesterday called on Serbia to explain its signature of a consultation plan on the sidelines of the UNGA between the Serbian and Russian foreign affairs. Is this really not a neo-colonial diktat? By refusing the inhabitants of Donbass and the liberated territories of Ukraine the right to self-determination, the Western delegations are demonstrating their egregious double standards. The loudest critics of the referendum in Donbass, Zaporozhia, and the Kherson Oblast were once at the forefront of supporting the independence of Kosovo. Then they stated that that territory did have the right to leave the Serbian state if there was a real threat that the rights of the Kosovo Albanians would be seriously violated, the so-called remedial succession. I'd underscore that it was not just statements, but rather the official legal position presented by Western countries in the UN International Court in 2008. At that time, the Kosovo Albanians, however, were not threatened by anything at all. Yugoslavia was no longer on the map. The NATO-bombed Serbia had foreign troops as peacekeepers in it. I'd like to underscore, unlike in the situation in Crimea, the LPR and DPR, Kherson and Zaporizhia people in Kosovo, like there in Kosovo, there was absolutely no referendum at all. There was no free people's votes. There was just a declaration of independence that was adopted by the interim self-governing authorities that exceeded their remit. At the time, that was sufficient for the West to recognize the independence of Kosovo, and it confirmed that international law did not prevent it from proclaiming its independence. We hear a completely different position from Western delegations today, yet another demonstration of their cynical double standards. Distinguished colleagues from developing countries, let you not be misled. Although Western delegations today bang on about apparent violations of international law and the principles of the UN Charter, in actual fact, this is not a cause for concern to them at all when it responds to their geopolitical interests, like in the situation of Kosovo, when it helps to achieve in the Balkans their own desires, hampering people to find their own path to development. Then Western countries fully support their right to self-determination. When we're talking about the self-determination as the only possible way of the inhabitants of Donbass saving themselves from genocide, then they say that these people don't have that right. The UN Charter contains the principle of territorial integrity. However, such respect in line with international law is not unconditional. As we know, the General Assembly collegially on a consensus basis provided an interpretation for the principle of territorial integrity in the Declaration on the Principal Relations between States in line with the UN Charter. It is as follows: all states are bound to respect the sovereignty and territorial integrity of any states whose government respects the principle of self-determination of its peoples and represents all peoples living in its territory. This important criteria is one that our Western colleagues today prefer to forget. After the state, or rather the coup d'etat in 2014, after the ban on the Russian language, on education, on the mass media, after the Maidan authorities for many years bombed their territory, whose population refused to recognize the results of a coup, after they burned alive Russian activists in Odessa, after Kiev shored up its regime, raising up the ethnic Ukrainian population above all, and raising up and glorifying fascist collaborators and their legacy. After all this, can somebody really say that the authorities in Kiev represent the interests of the population of Donbass, who they are trying with all their might to Ukrainize and to destroy? It's clear that those states who fully respect their people's rights and historically ethnic groups have no need to fear for their territorial integrity. Our neighbors in Europe, apart from the hopelessly Russia-phobic Baltic states, understand this perfectly, and they don't act like the Kiev regime does in its own countries. Belgium, Switzerland, Finland are the most obvious examples of tolerance and respect for cultures and languages. The same is true for the overwhelming majority of Asian and African states with varied ethnic compositions. It's just Ukraine, where the Russian-speaking population represents at least 40% of the population, got carte blanche from the West for its forced Ukrainization, despite in flagrant violation of any civilized norms and the recommendations of international organizations. So why is the West now astonished that the Russian troops in Ukraine are now being greeted as liberators, however long the NATO-obsessed Kiev regime has tried to claim the opposite, threatening the people there with punishment for being collaborators? We should say that the authorities in Kiev even stoop to use Russian language as a tactical, for tactical purposes. The president of Zelensky did not shy away over recent days from recording several video clips in Russian in order to try and undermine the recent announcement in Russia of the partial mobilization, in order to use the age-old driving a wedge between the authorities and the societies. It is they are saying that they are calling up non-ethnic Russians. That is what they're saying. And people who represent the indigenous peoples of Russia are being called up. That's what they're saying. But that is not what's happening in Russia. The Western propaganda regime has a hard time grasping what the mindset of the Russian people is. Our people understand where the truth lies and where lies are, or what they're fighting for. They've done so for centuries, just as their forefathers, their grandfathers and great-grandfathers did. Time after time, in bloody conflict, we have, in different historic periods, we have insisted on our right to our freedom, our right to choose our own path. But as we have done rather for decades and centuries, we will continue to insist on the interests of our fatherland and protect the young. It's in our genes, and no Western propaganda regime, no sophisticated political game playing will change us. Everybody understands that the only aim of the West that we're coming up against on our borders is to weaken and bleed dry Russia as much as possible. And their dream is to break up Russia and subject it to its own will. Dear colleagues, the desires and interests of Ukraine are not taken into consideration at all by the Western sponsors of Kiev. The Ukrainian people, as do the Russian people, want peace, but this scenario doesn't tie in with the plans of London and Washington, who incidentally have pumped billions of dollars into this on the back of other people's suffering. And the obliging Brussels functionaries are going along with this. Rather, they're rebuffing Kiev in March, and there were the staged operations in Bucha and the situation where they're trying to fight till the last Ukrainian. The situation is dire. Now, Kiev is being rejected not only by the people of Crimea and Donbass, but Kherson and Zaporozhye regions. This process is going to continue if Kiev does not recognize its mistake and its strategic errors, and doesn't start to be guided by the interests of its own people and not blindly carry out the will of those people who are playing them. I'd like to believe that in the Security Council and in the GA, there are colleagues who can tell Kiev what this actual truth really is. Thank you very much.
Je remercie.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation for his statement. I shall now make a statement in my capacity as the representative of France. I thank Ms. DiCarlo for her briefing. For 7 months, we've been calling on Russia to end its war of aggression against Ukraine. Despite our appeals, Russia has chosen escalation. Russia have chosen to go even further in violating the United Nations Charter and international law. By announcing a partial mobilization on the 21st of September, Russia is finally admitting a reality. It is waging an illegal war in Ukraine and not a so-called special operation. Russia is carrying on regardless by attempting to convene sham referendums since the 23rd of September in the currently occupied territories of Luhansk, Donetsk, Kharkiv, and Zaporizhia, which are an integral part of Ukrainian territory and which Russia does not wholly control. President Macron said very clearly, these so-called referenda are only a parody. They have no legal basis or any legitimacy. Let us be clear, the result, which is known in advance, does not represent the will of the Ukrainian people who are continuing to resist in a determined fashion against the Russian invader. Russia's gambit is well known. It's the same that it used to illegally annex Crimea in 2014. Russia aims to manipulate these sham referenda to claim to legitimize an annexation of territories that it is illegally occupying. The Secretary General recalled that any annexation of the territory of a state by another state by threatening to use or using force is a violation of the United Nations Charter and international law. France will never recognize these attempts of illegal annexation by Russia. All members of the United Nations must unequivocally reject these sham referenda. If we let Russia change internationally recognized borders of Ukraine by force, we would be letting them trample once again upon the principles of sovereignty and territorial integrity enshrined in the UN Charter and international law. The fate of the occupied territories of Ukraine is a concern to us all. Which country could consider itself safe if we turn a blind eye to what Russia is doing today? These sham referenda are another lie from Russia designed to distort reality. As Minister Colonna said last week in this same room, the reality is that Russia is continuing this war that it started, that it is continuing, and that it is exacerbating more and more every day. The reality is that Ukraine is exercising its right to self-defense and is fighting to defend its territory. The reality is that Ukraine's counter-offensive is succeeding thanks to the courage of its people. The reality is that tens of thousands of Russian citizens are fleeing their country to escape mobilization and an iniquitous war. France will continue to provide Ukraine with the support it needs for as long as is necessary to uphold its independence, its sovereignty, and its territorial integrity. We stand by Ukraine and its people. I resume my function as President of the Security Council. The representative of Albania has asked for the floor to intervene briefly.
Mr. President, and I hate asking for the floor one second time since it gives me the impression I was not clear enough. But in this case, I need to. This is not to prolong the discussion, of course, everything is clear, but to put the record straight. The Russian delegation made, again, a parallel with the Republic of Kosovo, an independent country that has been recognized by half of the United Nations, including half of this council. This is wrong, inaccurate, and regrettable. I have already reacted to similar remarks on this last June, therefore I'll be very short. Nothing could be more artificial and forced than comparing an international effort to end the conflict, protect civilians, and establish a peace process to find a lasting solution, which was the case of Kosovo, with a pure and unprovoked aggression and the sham referendums engineered in Moscow that are being carried out now in Ukraine. No one is, can, or will be fooled by this. No attempts to compare the incomparable, no easy shortcuts out of any historic and political context will help Russia divert attention from its war of choice in Ukraine or hide its blatant breach of international law, which has made it an international para. Kosovo and Serbia are bound today by a dialogue to solve their problems. They meet, they do not fight. And above all, the issue is not Kosovo or any part of the world. It's Russia's aggression, Russia's crimes, Russia's territory grab to the detriment of its neighbor. We will not be misled. I thank you.
Je remercie.
I thank the representative of Albania for that statement. I give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation who requested the floor. Mr. President, I'll be very brief. I just want to draw your attention to the fact that what we've just heard from the representative of Albania confirms the double standards that I was talking about regarding Kosovo. I gave an example as to how our Western colleagues dealt with Kosovo, those people who are calling on us to treat the referenda that are taking place in the territory that we're talking about. They're calling for a completely different approach here. Thank you.
Je remercie.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation for his statement. There are no further requests for the floor or names subscribed to the list of speakers. The meeting is adjourned.